and conscious media. She has over 2 decades of medical practice specializing in selling author. Dr. Andrea Pennington is an integrative physician, acupuncturist, and best-selling author. She is the founder of the online holistic platform Innate Vitality, which integrates ancient wisdom with modern neuroscience and conscious media. She has over 2 decades of medical practice specializing in trauma recovery, addiction medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, and acupuncture. Dr. Andrea has provided medical services, workshops, and retreats to help thousands of people to thrive in all areas of life. After years of running a successful intensive outpatient program for binge eating disorder, Dr. Andrea developed the Cornerstone process, a proven biopsychosocial spiritual model for healing trauma and facilitating conscious evolution. Fleet Mall, PhD, is an author, meditation teacher, executive coach, seminar leader, and social entrepreneur who works at the intersection of personal and social transformation. He developed the radical responsibility empowerment model that uniquely integrates personal and collective responsibility. Dr. Mall is a renowned growth mindset teacher who delivers his training programs and seminars around the world, both in person and online, through the Heart Mind Institute. Dr. Mall developed the neurosomatic mindfulness practice model, a deeply embodied neuroscience and trauma informed approach to mindfulness and awareness meditation practices that facilitate self healing, self regulation, and awakening.
Welcome back to the Collective Trauma Summit 2022. My name is Thomas Hübel. I'm the convener of the summit, and I'm so happy to sit here with you both, Andrea and Fleet. So welcome to our summit and welcome to this conversation.
Thank you. It's
Thank
an
you.
honor and a pleasure.
Thank you for having us. Great to be here with you and with Andrea.
Great. So I know we share a lot of passions, I guess, and I'm hoping to find the synchronicities and the coherence between us and what we all seem to love and seem to see as important in our time. And I think for many of us that do some kind of healing or collective healing work, of course, our own journey is an important driver. And so I'm curious, like, how did you get on your path and to do what you do? And how did your personal healing work inform your journey, if it did? So, and then maybe you can elaborate a bit about that, because I think that's always interesting for many of our listeners also, how we crystallize our own stream of contribution. So maybe, Andrea, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you. I have been on a trauma healing journey since childhood, actually. My work as an integrative physician started off with blending Chinese medicine and traditional medicine with psychology, and through an intensive outpatient program for binge eating disorder and substance use disorder. So I give you that background because working in that space, I instantly had to get training in trauma recovery. And for me, it was very interesting because I didn't realize how traumatized I actually was from my childhood. I have parents who, one was an immigrant from South America and an African American father. They divorced when I was 3. So I knew that the divorce had impacted me, especially with relationships. But it wasn't until I started working with other people who had experienced trauma or had adverse childhood experiences, it was only then that I started to realize I was carrying a lot of trauma and PTSD symptoms that I just sort of normalized. And I'm talking about things like hypervigilance, like perfectionism, a compulsive need to prove myself. And it really wasn't until my early 30s that I realized I didn't even love myself. And that was as a result of working with these clients who were telling me the same sort of things. I didn't have a problem with substances or eating disorders, but I did have a long history of depression and pretty intense anxiety. And I started to realize there were parallels between us. And as I started to look back over my childhood, I realized there was a lot to unpack. So I didn't know I was on the journey until I started treating trauma professionally. And over the last 20 years, it has evolved into a lot of the same work that you're doing, Thomas, with collective and group healing. I happened to develop a process that allowed people who were on their recovery journey to recover through group therapy. Still doing one-on-one, but principally being able to witness and hold compassion and unburden oneself. And it was incredibly healing for me as well. And that's what really got me on this journey of leaving behind the traditional path of medicine and really focusing on trauma and self-love.
That's amazing. And maybe you can say a few words on what was it actually in the methodology or the process that really where you felt that you could see some major progress in your own healing. Maybe you can speak about what really worked for you and maybe what didn't work so much. And then we hear from Fleet also. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I tried the traditional pathways. I was diagnosed with depression when I got to medical school. I grew up very artistic, so I was acting and singing and doing TV and all these sorts of things. And then I got to medical school and all I could do was study. And I fell into a pretty dark depression. And this was the first time I received a diagnosis of depression. Tried traditional antidepressants, started going to therapy, didn't really help. It kind of felt like a Band-Aid. What really helped me the most was performing. When I started to get back into music or playing piano or writing songs, that was actually what boosted my mood. But I really didn't have the great success until I was nearly at burnout and I didn't want my life anymore. I was having suicidal ideations. I had gotten to a point where my career was at an all-time high. So intellectually, I thought I have everything that, you know, the American dream says you should have. I had the career, I was famous, I was on TV, I had the money, and I was miserable. And the click for me was recognizing that I had suppressed part of my own soul. I had become disconnected from my authentic self by trying to fit in the box of the American medical system. I also worked in television at the time, hosting the news, doing documentary films, and I was trying to fit into the media box. It was very conservative. And it was literally realizing that I was at war with myself. And I had literally a dark night of the ego. I don't say it was a dark night of the soul. I say it was the dark night of
That's
the
great.
ego because it was the dawn of my soul, where my soul was crying out. And I literally surrendered to the divine. I happened to be here. I spent some time in Barcelona and Cannes and Saint-Tropez. And I just had this crisis of just calling out to God, saying, take it, take my life, take it all, because I don't know what I'm doing, but I didn't want my life anymore. And I'd already made a pact with whatever divine force that I wouldn't take my own life. So I asked God to do it for me. And I had an out-of-body, near-death-like experience where I saw a complete life review and I understood why I was depressed. It was because of all these choices that I'd made since birth. Now, at the time, I'm thinking, well, I didn't know that I could choose. I mean, especially as a baby, I didn't choose, but there was a force during this out-of-body experience that sort of transferred this knowledge, like, you get to choose who you are, who you will be, and what you do in this life. You know, you're a divine droplet of God consciousness. And it was really that spiritual awakening that put me on my true healing path. And it's just blossomed ever since.
That sounds very powerful. I have so many so many questions immediately, but let's hear maybe Fleet. Do you want to comment also how your journey unfolded and emerged?
Yeah, sure. My journey into this work certainly began in childhood, similar to Andrea's. I grew up in my family of origin was beset with alcoholism. It was a interesting situation. My mother was an episodic alcoholic, so most of the time she was this wonderful beatific mother, very artistic, wonderful person. We had a good family with good values, and most of the time a relatively normal family, but once or twice a week it would erupt into complete chaos, and my mother would shift into this rageaholic, out of control alcoholic. And when my father wasn't around, she'd come after me. Now, all this started a little, I don't know, maybe when I was 6 or 7 in my awareness. So prior to that, I remember feeling really plugged into life. The life was very magical and vivid. And once this started happening, there was a complete splitting and everything went to gray tones. I think there was a kind of low grade depression permeated my life. But it was also this fundamental splitting because how could I make sense of these two different worlds? One world, which was a world of normalcy, and this other world of chaos. And it was never talked about. There'd be this episode, and the next morning you'd be at breakfast with my mother serving breakfast, and nobody would ever say anything, right? So I think that really set me up for this journey, and I came of age in the '60s, and so my anger and the hole in my gut took me directly into the counterculture of the time, and that was a mixed thing as well, because on the one hand there was the whole psychedelic exploration and early experiences of non-self and interconnectedness and inner being, which changed my life forever, and realizing the world is not inanimate in any form and feeling deeply connected to that, but then also going into hard drug use and so forth, and going into the darkness of all that. And eventually, and living as an expat, justifying getting into criminality of drug trafficking, justifying all this. So, it set me up for this split life. I was a spiritual seeker on the other one hand. On the other hand, I was into this kind of dark path of criminality and harder drug use. And so all that eventually along the way, I'm got trained as a psychotherapist in the midst of all that. It's hard to believe, but did a lot of therapy, a lot of group therapy, got a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology, contemplative psychotherapy, and deeply trained in the Buddhist tradition. And before I could untangle all that, I ended up in prison. And so I did 14 years on drug trafficking charges, but I came in there with a lot of skills, and it was a pressure cooker environment. Can be it was a very traumatizing environment, and I know I'm still holding trauma from that experience, but nonetheless, it was one that I could really leverage for deep transformation. And I was doing a lot of the inner yogic practices of the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition. So in some ways, I see that 14-year period in prison as my period of deep healing and deep transformation. And coming out of that is where I started moving into the council work, various kinds of circle work, the bearing witness work through the Zen peacemakers. And actually, one last aside there, in prison was where I encountered a particular work simply described as the event. But it's a very intense, kind of old school group process that is deep shadow work, deep trauma work. And today I still lead that training. I haven't led it during the pandemic, but I will lead it again. And now we do it in a much more trauma-informed way. But the collective work for me was always important in my healing, whether it was in the recovery work of AANA or the council work, and now the bearing witness work.
Wow. Also, like when you both speak, I have so many questions, tracks to follow. But just for you also, Cleet, when you look at what was it in your own healing work that really created a transformation, when you look back and see, okay, all the things that I did, some of it scratched the surface and some of it really went deep and changed something from inside. If the second one, what reached your core that it created a transformation for you?
Well, three things come up for me. One is having had those plant medicine experiences that connected me to this vast space of interbeing, and that changed everything, even though I was still dealing with all kinds of trauma and shadow issues. The other was through my Tibetan Buddhist path and my connection to my teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was getting the very direct experience of my own unconditional goodness, and having had that affirmed again and again, and through practice and being able to access where it was just absolutely unmistakable to me, apart from whatever might be going on in the many, many layers of trauma and confusion, that my fundamental being was fundamentally pure and good, and that I could reside in that. And then I think the third thing was that training that I first encountered in prison that I still lead, because it was in the event that even all the psychological work I'd done, all the group therapy work I'd done, I had not seen how deeply, at such a deep level, my conditioning, my childhood conditioning, and my trauma were still playing out in my life. And it was really there that I saw that with such crystal clarity, that I think that really opened up the work for the kind of ultimate healing of that childhood trauma.
Maybe let's go one step forward for both of you and see, okay, when you take the essence of your learning, like the essence of your own transformation, and you see how that became the fertilizer of your own work. So maybe you can speak a little bit to why, like we are sitting here also in the context of the Collective Trauma Summit. So we are talking about trauma, or at least I'm exploring why or how trauma, ancestral trauma and collective trauma, like a one fluid system or a rigid system, depends, but it's one interconnected field. And why both of you think, given your where you come from and what you do today, why do we need to address trauma on a more collective level? Why is that important? And what's the interconnection to the individual work and how you look at this we interdependence? So maybe you can both speak to that. Maybe start again with you, Andrea.
Sure. I feel like all of the experiences that I had personally, I was, a very driven healer type, spiritual seeker and healer. And even with all the epiphanies that I had from that spiritual awakening, I realized that there was kind of a ceiling that I got to in my healing. And I also saw that in my clients. Now, I will say at the time when I was running this intensive outpatient program, we had everything. We had Chinese medicine and acupuncture, a spa, nutrition therapy, psychotherapy. So we had everything sort of created in this magic bubble. And I would see that some patients still wouldn't get better. And once we addressed that lack of self-love, the next thing was unpacking a lot of the beliefs and the stored energy from trauma. And it was several years into my practice that I realized some of this isn't theirs. And that's when I started to look at myself and realize some of this isn't mine. So I could do all this great work, whether for myself or my clients, and hit a ceiling. And that was when I realized that there is this intergenerational loop. Of course, we know about the collective trauma of depending on where you were socialized or where you grew up, there's all of that. But I recognized that there was a need to address the intergenerational trauma, the levels of trauma that we may not even see. And that for me was kind of pivotal because once again, coming from sort of a traditional Western model, then integrating Chinese medicine and meditation and Tantra and all these other things, I realized we're going to have to go outside of the mold here. This is not, traditional therapy. And like you, Fleet, I had some experiences with psychedelics, MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca that really opened up my consciousness to see, like literally see that there are imprints, and I can do all the work that I can on myself, but there is this aspect of collective healing that also must take place if we really want to move forward in our conscious evolution. And so that's where it's brought me to today. And it's once again integrating all of these various modalities and getting into that collective unconscious wounding. I also incorporate into that narrative therapy so that we can start to reclaim the power of our stories. And I'm finding that too is incredibly powerful in this work.
Do you want to say a few words about the narrative therapy when you say reclaiming our power? Maybe for our listeners to hear a bit about that.
Sure. So what I learned early on in my trauma healing days is that many of us have a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And some of that story, we know and we rehearse. Like, I'm Andrea Pennington. I'm an American, born, in the United States. I had, X, Y, and Z trauma. Those are the things that we're conscious of. But there are also imprints, messages, and stories that got burned into my unconscious even before I had language. So as a baby, there were messages being imprinted. And depending on your worldview, even prior lifetimes, those messages. So what I mean is we have a story that we tell ourselves. It's a narrative. And if we are in a sort of fixed mindset and we think, these are my traumas, this is my background, I can't change, then you will adopt sort of a victim mentality. But as I started working with clients, we realized you can change the narrative. You may not be able to change what happened in the past, but you can change the meaning that you may have made that wasn't empowering at age 3. You can change that. And that's where the power comes from. Reclaiming the power to say, okay, my dad said that, or my mother said that, or the coach said that about me, but that's not true. Or maybe it was true then, but it's not true for me now. I can reclaim that narrative. And so through journaling, through meditation, we help clients change their life trajectory moving forward by imprinting new meaning on the past and gleaning the lessons from those painful past experiences so that it empowers us to have post-traumatic growth for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. And Fleet, how about you?
Well, I really deeply resonate with everything Andrea has been sharing. My journey through prison and working, I was very active in during those 14 years, creating all kinds of programs. It was a federal prison hospital, so we were doing hospice work with our fellow prisoners. I was teaching meditation, doing the recovery work, leading all kinds of trainings, and one of the things I really discovered was there wasn't one thing that would do it. When I began to see real change in myself and other prisoners I was working with, was an integrated approach or an integral approach that involved lots of things. It involved some kind of self-awareness practice. It involved shadow work. It involved service work. It involved the recovery work. It involved, in this case, there was some kind of Jungian men's work we were doing there. There was all kinds of things. And when I began to see myself and other fellow prisoners involved in a constellation of these different modalities is when I began to see really deep change. So I became a deep believer in integrated and integral approaches, and it still guides my work today. But like Dr. Andrea, I also saw that there is somewhat of a ceiling or a limitation to our individual work because we're all in this collective work together. We all participate in the collective trauma of humanity, very sadly and tragically, many more so than others, and often around the fault lines of various kinds of injustice. But we all participate in it, and we all heal together. And of course, this really aligns with my Buddhist training that I've been involved in for the last 50 years, and the basic Mahayana Buddhist understanding that there is really that the idea of personal liberation is somewhat of a myth in the end, that it is our collective liberation, and so we can only go as far as we can all go in some sense. And so, in some ways that could be seen as a limitation, but once you kind of surrender to that, then it's, I think, tremendously liberating to surrender to and relax into that we're all on this journey of liberation together, and we're going through this suffering, and we're dealing with the collective shadow work together. And so, since my time in prison, that's really impacted my work. Just to color the landscape a little bit, I'm still very involved in working with at-risk incarcerated returning youth and adults in many different ways. Also today, I work with the correctional officers, the probation and parole officers, the police, the judges, the prosecutors, and it's really the same trauma and the same suffering. And then with the Zen Peacemakers, I've been going to Auschwitz for the last 21, 22 years now. I'll be going in November, doing the Bearing Witness retreat work, and we've done Bearing Witness retreats, 4 of them in Rwanda, an annual Bearing Witness retreat with Indigenous people, Native Americans in particular, in the Black Hills and South Dakota, North Dakota. We've been doing Bearing Witness retreats around the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. And all of this work, it just becomes clear and clear to me that there are many wonderful modalities for healing. And generally, it's an integral approach that I see have most traction, but then also the humility to realize that regardless of what we're doing and what personal awakenings we have and insights we have and moments of healing, we're still in this collective journey together, and that's not a limitation. That's actually an amazing thing, and we can begin to have confidence. And I think there's a confidence that comes from that, because it's so easy to fall into despair because the suffering seems so huge, the trauma seems so huge, so global, and we're seeing the continual eruption of violence out of the frozen tundra, as you explain it, of collective trauma, like the war in Ukraine currently and so many other things. And so we can really easily be despaired around that. But if we begin to kind of sense that we're actually in this collective journey as humanity, and this is all part of it, then I think that it's a much brighter, more hopeful vision. It gives one energy to continue one's own path of transformation as well as working with others.
So when I ask a similar question like before, because when you both share a little bit in the approaches you both practice and give to people, what are the things that are really transformational? Well, if you were to collect, let's say, the 4 or 5 essentials of the trauma work that really essential for any kind of transformation, and we narrow it down to some core principles, maybe you can both speak a bit to what really works, what transforms trauma, what transforms the frozen past into a new way of aliveness, creativity, a new way of flourishing. Yeah, maybe Dr. Andrea.
Yes, thank you. Well, over the last, I guess, 20 years, what has been really distilled down for me is a 5-step framework. I call it the cornerstone process. And if you think of architecture, the cornerstone is this very intentionally laid stone in a building or a foundation. And for me, the cornerstone is self-love. If we're really going to build in this body temple a healthy, vital life, we need that cornerstone of self-love. And the 5 essential elements starts with awareness. And so for me, we couple awareness with the intellectual awareness, like looking at the family tree, just seeing what is so about your genetics, about your conditioning, if you know your genetics, and what sort of environment did you grow up in, to really identify the ego and how it was formed, so that you can start to identify what is the authentic self. Because I found if people don't have that awareness of true self, whether you get that through meditation, chanting, prayer, an out-of-body experience like I had, or with psychedelics, breath work, it's really essential that we start to touch into that authentic self. So it starts with awareness, and then we move to acceptance. It's if you don't have acceptance, it's really hard to move forward if you're stuck in blame or shame or guilt. So we move from that acceptance of what was the past and infuse a ton of compassion. And we can do that in the group therapy process, especially as we start to witness and hear others and realize I'm not alone. And that's what happened for me. I thought I was just one little weirdo. And then I realized in sitting in so many groups, whether it was AA or our private groups, like I'm not alone and I can have so much compassion for myself and for others. And so when we move past acceptance, then we get into accountability. And that was a critical turning point to releasing trauma, because without it, you stay in victim mentality. Like all these things happened to me, or there's this, constructional racism or oppression. But when we move into accountability, this says, I am now taking back responsibility for my life going forward. I can't change what happened in the past, but I can be the conscious choice maker in the present moving forward. And that's really pivotal as we want to look at post-traumatic growth. And then the 4th element of the cornerstone process is inspired action. And this was hard for me because I was a compulsive doer. I always felt like I needed to be doing and productive and looking good. But when you really shift to trauma healing and trusting the authentic self, and also your connection to whatever you believe in, there comes a moment where you say, I don't want to just do stuff that looks good on the outside. I want it to come from an inspired place. And so we either take inspired action or we take no action and we wait on inspiration. And the 5th and final process in the Cornerstone framework is appreciation. And we all know that if we don't find ways to buffet and increase positive emotion consciously without waiting for something good to happen, then we can often get stuck in those downward spirals. And so through my contemplative work, we added in this process of appreciation, like looking at even the tiniest thing, a cup of coffee or a good Wi-Fi connection, a fan, an AC, or just a good friend that you can call on when you're really going through it, and really savoring with gratitude whatever is going right in your life. So those are the 5 aspects of the cornerstone process that for me, I've returned to in my own healing work and with my clients. And it really helps to guide people through trauma healing, because as you know, healing your trauma can be very chaotic. Like you start and you think you're going on one path, and then something else comes up, and then another thing comes up, and then someone triggers you. But I found that this framework just gives us like a skeleton process that you can return to time and time again and move forward consciously.
Beautiful, lovely. Yeah, thank you. And Fleet, what comes up for you?
Well, it's really clear for me why Dr. Andrea and I have been working together, and we have such affinity and alignment. I'm gonna address 2 things, which is my radical responsibility work, and then the bearing witness model of what we call the 3 tenets in the bearing witness model. So my radical responsibility model is really the integration of personal and collective responsibility, and it's very similar to Dr. Andrea's cornerstone process. And for me, the ground is self-love, self-compassion, and that in service of having that experience of one's own unconditional goodness. And I think we can get there through contemplative practices and practices of self-compassion. And it's also absolutely, it can be very helpful, let's say, to have that affirmed by another. So ideally, that's what parents are affirming for their children. And for most of us, it was a mixed bag, the degree at which we got that or not that affirmation. But to have one's fundamental being affirmed. And we can do that for ourselves through contemplative means. And self-compassion is really the vehicle to get there. But having that experience of knowing, even if we can't completely live from that space, but we have some access to a space where we know that fundamentally I'm not broken, I'm not fixing, I'm not missing anything. And all the lies I've heard my whole life about not enoughness are just that, lies. And so I think that's fundamental. Some kind of self-awareness practice to where we begin to get insight into really how our own psychology and neurobiology works, and in particular what Dr. Andrea brought up before about narratives. Really getting that clear insight that we're living our life from a narrative, and that narratives are malleable. And if the narrative that we're living our life from isn't working out well, we can actually change that narrative. And that ultimately, you know, we're doing that individually and collectively. And I think really our collective global process of transformation for humanity, we need to have a much deeper understanding of the narratives that are driving both the positive and negative kind of momentum in human culture. And so really understanding the force and the power of narrative, but also the malleability of narrative, and that we can change it. And we can also have experiences free of narrative. And so Dr. Andrea brought up this way in which we can find ourselves living from a victim mindset and from a fixed mindset. And really the work individually is about how to liberate that and get out of that. I use Cartman's drama triangle a lot in the radical responsibility work of understanding the triangulation between the victim mindset, the persecutor mindset, and the rescuer mindset, all 3 of which continually fuel drama, and both the drama in our individual lives, the drama between our ears, the drama in our families, the destructive, toxic drama, and the toxic drama that plays out on the world stage is endless war and conflict and re-traumatization and so forth. So it's a combination of this kind of inner work, but also doing that at a collective level. So I'm just going to bring in quickly the bearing witness work, which has been so helpful in my life. So we employ these 3 tenets of not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action or compassionate action. And so not knowing is that ability to step out of identity with self-compassion. We're not, nothing wrong with our identities. And in some cases, many of us, we need to have our identities and our narratives really affirmed. But then, you know, from that place of self-compassion, being able to step out of the narrative into not knowing, which we described as letting go of fixed ideas about ourselves and the world and others and so forth. And I think that's really the goal of all the inner contemplative practices of the world's contemplative traditions, is how do you get out of conditioned mind into actual direct experience of reality? That's not knowing. And then from that place, bearing witness, not running away, being willing to let life touch us, and the joy and suffering of life really penetrate and touch our hearts. And then from that place, human beings have been finding out for millennia that to the extent that you're able to bear witness from a place of not knowing, what naturally arises is wisdom-based action, because we have innate goodness and we have innate wisdom. And so when you get into direct relationship with reality, from that heart-centered place, what naturally arises is wisdom-based action. So in all the work I've done, I find it so helpful. And to me, it's such a doorway to not get caught in the very divisive kind of efforts to change the world and change our lives that can just refuel the trauma and perpetuate endless cycles of conflict and victimization and being locked into fixed mindsets. So the practice of bearing witness, this capacity to be self-reflective individually and collectively, and to bear witness from a place that's at least momentarily free of the identities and the narratives. Not that it's not honoring those, but to get that window into, okay, you know, just seeing things as they are from a place of deep compassion, and then trusting that what will come out of that is our innate wisdom.
So witnessing and kind of non-dissociated witnessing, I guess that's what you speak about, because we can see things and not feel anything, or we can be a witness that is engaged and connected. So in the witnessing, we allow ourselves to be informed, like to have a form of the world, or you, a person, and whatever part of the world in us, and that so we are represented in one another. And I'm curious, when we look at that kind of witnessing as a group process, and I'm sure you both do the work that you described also in groups. So what's the power of, how would you describe the power to do trauma work, healing work, collective trauma work in groups? And what does a group add to the trauma work that a one-on-one setting cannot provide, maybe, if there is something like that? Maybe Dr. Andrea, do you want to start us off again? Thank you.
Sure. So much like you, Fleet, a lot of the group work that I engaged in was 12 steps and people with substance use disorder and eating disorders, as I mentioned. And it was pretty profound to me. I've already mentioned that just that bearing witness to someone else's process helped people to feel less alone and less ashamed, like we're not the only one. But over the last, I'd say 15 years in being able to facilitate groups outside of 12 steps, I'm now really appreciating how we create our own collective healing field. And in that group process, we have more of a freedom to let down our barriers. Now, of course, that can happen in one-on-one sessions with a great, really attuned therapist. But the reason I like facilitating groups is because there's just more that can come up. Like, I have my traumas, but there are oftentimes traumas in other people that I don't have the same, but as I witness them unburden and get the healing and evolve, I get the same benefit. Even if I didn't have the exact same trauma, I get the same benefit just by witnessing. I also find that, creating this field of compassion in a group setting where we create this resonance, which, I really enjoyed your most recent book, Thomas, and hearing about, creating resonance and learning how to ground and be that safe space. I have found it incredible because I will often get clients who join a group who are not ready to talk. So they will just participate silently, maybe even off camera. And then 6 months in, all of a sudden, they're ready to share. And we're hearing that just by witnessing and being present for others, they've gotten their healing. They've gotten to a point where they're now ready to be seen and to participate. And sometimes you can't do that all by yourself. It's very hard to show up at a therapy session and you don't say anything. But you can do that in a group. And when you get to the point of feeling comfortable and creating that sort of safety and vulnerability, it accelerates. And certainly, as we see, when you add in entheogens or psychedelic sacred plant medicines, for example, or fungi, that also creates this resonant energy field that can be incredibly liberating. So for me, I find it often frustrating because I have VIPs that will say, oh, no, I don't want to do groups. I just want to do one-on-one. And I welcome them, but I tell them that by attending the groups, you're going to find that it heightens the experience.
Beautiful. Yeah. It's pretty much my experience too. And so Fleet, how about you?
Yeah, I want to address the group work. Just as a prelude to that, I want to circle back to one thing. This notion of radical responsibility, moving beyond victim mindsets into accountability and both individual and collective ownership, it's really important to understand the distinction between ownership and blame. Our culture is so permeated with blame and shame that often we think that somebody's got to be to blame, right? There's always someone at fault. And I think we can learn to embrace that we can actually embrace a high degree of ownership, both individually and collectively, that has nothing to do with self-blame. It only has to do with learning, and has nothing to do with blaming others, and it has nothing to do with blaming victims, obviously. But it's really this idea of just owning our experience individually and collectively so that we do the work to keep moving forward and progressing. So in terms of the group work, um, really that began for me during my master's program, where I did all kinds of group therapy work, Gestalt work, Tavistock work, psychodynamic work, and then during my prison years, being deeply involved in the recovery work, and then some of the other group work I did in the prison setting. So that was always incredibly powerful for me. And then coming out of prison, getting trained at the Ojai Foundation in the way of counsel, which involves deep listening, deep witnessing, sharing deeply from the heart, and so forth. And these collective processes, as well as some of these other very intense group processes that I lead, there's this collective witnessing and collective mirroring, which can do two things. One, it can really surface all the shit. I think group work is the ideal way to surface shadow work, right? To access the shadows, both individually and collectively, because we keep that so suppressed, right? And we operate so much from the persona. Even Scott Peck's work around group work, moving out of pseudo community into conflict and being willing to go there, and then the process of emptying before we come into authentic community, right? So it's necessary to surface the shadow elements, and I think group work is the most powerful way to do that. So there's both that kind of collective mirroring that can trigger things that will surface the shadow and can be done in safe ways if that's really held well. And I think co-facilitation and group facilitation is really important. And then, but also then it can also mirror that basic goodness. It can mirror the unconditional basic goodness. So I think we can discover that together. One of the most powerful experiences I've had with that was sitting in circles in Rwanda, where we were doing bearing witness work, bearing witness to the impact of the genocide there, and deeply listening to stories in circles with both Hutu and Tutsi survivors of the genocide, and some considered perpetrators, some considered survivors, and sharing their stories and listening to their stories, seeing forgiveness happening, and doing that, and then continuing to train genocide survivors as kind of paracounselors to do that work. And I probably sat in, I don't know, 30 or 40 circles there, and to see this community of transformation arise that was both this honest recognition, I mean, of just the worst that you could ever have to bear witness to, and doing that with honesty and people owning their participation in that, and then also the clear mirroring of that humanity, that basic goodness. I've never seen anywhere where that can happen as powerfully as it does in collective group processes like that.
Yeah, that's true. Like, I really echo what you both said. Like, I'm a big fan of big group work and the resonances, and also, Andrea, what you said before, like how one process triggers the next process, and how we all learn together in an intelligent field, and we liquefy what separates us. So that's beautiful. Fleet, you said one thing that I would like you both, because it seems like an essential part. You said it in a side sentence, like to own our experience. When you say own our experience, can you maybe speak a bit to that, how one owns his or her experience? And maybe you can both comment on that, because it seems like that we sometimes say that, but maybe it's not fully clear how that works. If it's such an essential part of the work that we're all doing.
Yes, absolutely, because I think it is so essential. And, we've all been kind of enculturated, maybe it's just a human condition, to not own, to externalize, to deflect, because, we all have very tender hearts and we've all been wounded. So we just immediately deflect any fear of being blamed or isolated or even being focused on, right? And so we have this tendency to split and to deflect and to project. And it's part of the human condition. So I think first is having the self-awareness to see that, or being educated into that. So we see this is just part of the human condition and how we operate from a fear-based place, and that there's another possibility of learning to operate from confidence in our own innate goodness, and then really taking ownership of all of our own psychological dynamics and emotional experiences and narratives and really our own neurobiology, realizing that we actually are the architects of our own neurobiology, and that we can start to live from choice. And I think that's really beginning to see the power of living from choice, because until we recognize that power of living from choice, on one level or another, we're living from some kind of victim narrative. Life feels like something happening to me instead of for me and with me. So it's really somehow seeing that power, that choice, rather than being something that's going to pivot us into self-blame and shame, it's actually the doorway into freedom, which requires courage, but also really requires a tremendous level of the self-love that Dr. Andrea was talking about. So we have to build the foundation to be able to step into that. But I think it's really seeing that all possibility and freedom and agency, both individually and collectively, happens through ownership and choice. And we really have to do the work to change the momentum of the fear-based human condition and all the cultural collective kind of momentum of that, to make that shift into ownership and choice. But then the possibilities open up, and it's just everything is possible at that point.
Thank you. Dr. Andrea?
Yes, I love this question. Owning our experience. This has been something that for me has blossomed in just the last 9 months. So I mentioned that my mother was from South America. She was born in British Guyana, and she was born in 1933. So she had a relationship with colonialism that she actually romanticized. She really had a passion for the Brits. She was able to go to England and do nursing school, and then immigrated to America. And she always carried a fondness for the Queen Mother. And what's interesting is that when my mother got to the United States, she was a nurse and she went to medical school, and she experienced a lot of racism and sexism. As a dark brown skinned woman with a funny accent, I remember her telling me stories. And her approach to dealing with racism was just brush it off and show them that you're better. Show them that you're as good as them or better. So when I, as a young person, experienced racism, I didn't feel that I had a welcome listening audience at home. What I interpreted was, okay, I've just got to be better. Don't let it affect you. And then when I started to hear people talk about, my mom was an immigrant, and they had these very negative statements, it created in me, without me knowing it, a sense of wanting to hide that part of my ethnicity. Well, my mother transitioned from this world during the end of the pandemic. And her death allowed me to really look at her influence in my life, both positive and negative. And sitting in a sacred ceremony with psilocybin mushrooms, I was really able to come to terms with owning my experience of racism, enduring the suppression of my racial identity, because I also experienced times where I grew up in Denver, Colorado. I then moved for high school to Atlanta, Georgia, and I experienced colorism. So I was hazed and told that I wasn't really Black, not Black enough. And so I was stuck with this, not really owning my Guyanese heritage, not feeling fully Black, and certainly not white. And it was really in my mother's transition and really returning to my ancestry to realize no, I need to own this. This is part of who I am. This is part of what makes me a rich being. And I do feel like for my own personal healing, that was pivotal. Owning my experience, the positive and the negative, has made me feel more whole and more self-accepting and more self-loving. So I love that you bring up this question in terms of healing, because especially as we are in America and elsewhere, really looking at race-based trauma and feeling that oppression for so many years, and now feeling free to talk about it. you know I never imagined that we would have so much discussion in the media or social media that we're having now about race-based trauma and colonialism and white supremacy. But it is pivotal in our healing process, because until we can own who we are and feel a sense of pride, getting past that shame and the guilt, it's like that little pebble in your shoe. If you don't address it, yeah, you might have shoes on, you might be walking, but you're never fully in that sense of thriving, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's beautiful, to listen to both of you, and it's also beautiful to see what I hear from you, Andrea, is like that when once you reconcile through your own awareness, like your roots more and more in and integrated them, then you felt also more grounded and at home in yourself. So that leads me to another question though, is how do you both integrate the kind of ancestral work, like because you spoke now to what you got from your mother and what you got from your environment and what you got through your ancestry, the conditioning needs to be looked at by us. So everything that has been unintegrated, our parents, grandparents handed over to us. And if we take that responsibly, like able to respond to that, and we feel it with awareness, so it actually, we heal that part in ourselves, which enriches our lives and ancestry. And so I'm wondering how you both, how that's part of your work. So maybe you can both speak a little bit to the ancestral healing work. Maybe let's start now with Fleet, since Andrea spoke.
Yeah. So, I want to ground that one thing that I have neglected to bring forward so far, and that's the importance of the body in all of this, and the importance of embodiment. And I think my own process of ownership has been a very embodied process. And in prison, part of that was really finally facing all the harm I'd been doing in my life, and being willing to sit in that. And that's at one point I had this profound motivation. Once I really, really faced it at the most deep level, what the harm I'd done to my son, to myself, but the harm I've been doing through being involved in drug trafficking and so forth, was that I had this profound desire just to cause no more harm. And I would just be in tears of just the deep longing to just cause no more harm. And so really taking that into my being and owning that. And as I've involved in the collective work of where we are as humanity today, that's owning my participation in colonialism. It's owning my participation in, everything that perpetuates racial suffering in our country and the world. And being in Auschwitz each year, the very first time I went to the Auschwitz retreat, I remembered I thought my fear would come up around being afraid of, the specter of what the Nazis did, and the fear of being victimized. And since I went there just a year after getting out of prison, and being in the camps was not dissimilar from the feel and look of the prisons, that I would identify with that part of it. But I found what I was really facing was feeling and having to own that perpetrator inside myself. And that's what I was really viscerally feeling, that this is part of my family lineage. This is part of my genetic lineage, and that perhaps even I could have been one of these people in another lifetime or something. So it was really owning that. And so I think for me, the ancestral work has been, understanding, the role of colonialism in the U.S. and really imagining I've done a lot of work throughout my life in South America and in the U.S. Been very grateful to have a lot of opportunities to be connected with indigenous peoples, and I've learned so much there. And I remember one transformative book for me was reading the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which chronicled the destruction of the native peoples by the Anglos coming from the east and the Spaniards coming from the west. And at one point I realized that I was part of a family lineage, even though my family were basically good people with good middle class values. They weren't overtly racist or anything like that, and were actually involved in some progressive things. But I realized that they were of a social structure that back in that time would have embraced the idea that Indians are savages, and even something like the only good Indian is a dead Indian, things that were said back in that time during the conquest and the Holocaust of Native peoples. So I had to brace that I'm part of this. This is in my blood. It's in my genes. This is part of who I am. And then being in Europe with the bearing witness work, and being in Africa doing the bearing witness work, to realize that I had to own that all of this is in my genes, and that I really need to be able to sit in this and feel this in my body, right? And so I think both individually and collectively, the transformational work has to be really grounded in the body. And I think the ultimate way we own things, again, is to feel it and embrace it in the body. And the interesting thing, the deeper we go into the body and the deeper into our being, the more connected we are to everyone and everything. And so we get into this matrix of collective ownership where, yes, I have participated in all of this. I am part of all of this human suffering. And it's through embracing that and being really willing to do the painful work of looking at how just I'm set up genetically and psychologically and through my conditioning to still participate in it and to still perpetuate it. And if I'm not willing to see that, then I'm going to, in a sense, unconsciously be part of a perpetrating force. And so I have to continually go deeper and deeper to deconstruct that in myself and be willing to see it and have the resources of self-compassion to be able to do that without just falling into self-blame and shame. So to me, that's the kind of landscape of the work. And, my parents were the World War II generation, so there's so much to understand about that. I think we really need to deeply understand it. I think if we don't deeply understand our personal history and our collective history, it's been said many, many times, if we don't look at that and understand it, we're just conditioned to repeat it. So I think that kind of work, this ancestral framework, is so important. But I think we really do it through the body. It's an embodied process.
Like you, I think for me, spending time looking at indigenous cultures and their process of honoring ancestors, and then looking at the African diaspora and recognizing how we too can honor and help with the healing of our ancestors, it's critical. Studying epigenetics kind of made intellectual sense for me for understanding these ancestral ties and connections. And so now in my work, I mentioned that the first step of the cornerstone process is awareness. And so we do a full family tree if that's accessible for people. And even if it's not, through our meditation and our guided visualizations, we can call forward these ancestors to honor them, to thank them, to give them forgiveness, to ask for forgiveness, and to feel that empowerment that all that they endured or sacrificed brought us to this point where we can now live forward a legacy. So we incorporate it into our work in that way.
Yeah, I see. And so I think we all agree that the ancestral work is an important part of it. And now, given the time, maybe you can both just share a little bit about, when one looks into our world, with the amounts of trauma we are dealing with, for many people it might look very dark, or it looks like hopeless. And anyway, there's climate change, there are wars, there are droughts, there are like so many things that people would say, listen, how can we ever deal with all of that? And if you maybe in a shorter version both speak to what is actually resourcing us, what's resourcing you, what gives you the power to work with those kind of painful areas of our life every day and still be happy. And so what's the inner resourcing, or what gives us kind of a bit of a light on the way for this journey?
What gives me hope and perseverance in all of this is my spiritual practice and my spiritual beliefs. I'm also on a Buddhist path, but even before I formally took my vows, having that out of body experience, I felt oneness, and I recognized that we are all one. And there was a shift for me when I realized that the work that we do is cleaning up our karma. And yes, I may not be able to affect every little change in the climate and racism and the economy, but every bit of work that I do is clearing out and cleaning out these karmic imprints, and it's helping us collectively move forward. I happen to have that belief that we will reincarnate. So the more work that we do on our karma now, and creating merit, positive karma, is going to move us forward collectively.
That's very powerful. Yes. And Fleet?
I think for me, what really allows me to remain in a positive place and do my work, one thing is my own personal spiritual practice and meditation practice. And not that I'm able to live there, but at least in my practice daily, to be able to spend a little bit of time, most of the time, in some aspect of non-self is just so liberating and so freeing. And then also having a sense of scale about it all. I've loved the photos coming back from the latest NASA telescope, the Webb telescope, of just seeing, you're looking billions of years into the past and seeing into the immensity of the cosmos and realizing on some level we are part of some life process that is so much bigger than anything we can imagine. And that on some level it's all okay. On some level it's life and it's all okay. And in any aspect it can get really difficult and really painful, but on some level it is the unfolding of a life process. But then balancing that with a sense of urgency and realizing that we are carrying an unsustainable toxic load of trauma and internalized oppression and so forth in our human culture, and it will continue to erupt as violence if we don't do something. So every time we can prevent an act of child abuse, every time, or neglect, every time we can prevent a war and immigration, we have to have a sense of urgency around this. And you brought up climate change. Obviously, there's a tremendous sense of urgency there. So how can we respond to the urgency, but from some trust in our own innate goodness and some trust that life is unfolding in a way that we're part of, that we can't control, and ultimately is a benevolent process in the end.
So what I hear from both of you is that the spiritual essence, the core, like what you call, Dr. Andrea, the authentic self or no self, or like different states of our contemplative practice, are basically a deep essential part of what resources us when we do our healing work. So that's very powerful, and I'm completely in resonance with that. But I love to hear that that's true for you too. So I have so many more questions. We just scratched the surface, and I wanted to go into so many different parts that we don't have time for now, but I would love to continue the conversation, definitely. And I think there's a lot of resonance that we could deepen together. But thank you, both of you, for sharing your wisdom here. And I really enjoyed your transmission. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your work and this summit, and really for giving voice to this need to develop a global healing community. I think it's just so important. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both.
Additionally, people can learn more about Fleet and his work on the website hmi.fleetmall.com, and you can learn more about Andrea and her work at andreapennington.com. Fleet has offered a bonus gift of the Neurosomatic Mindfulness ebook, and Dr. Andrea has offered 3 keys to become the hero to your life, a life writing and guided meditation program, which are both available while Fleet and Andrea's talk airs free, or by purchasing the Collective Trauma Healing Upgrade Package 2022, which includes all of the interview and event recordings, transcripts, and bonuses for 50% off during the summit.